Hi, boys and girls. Today we are going to read chapters 12, 13, and 14. Chapter 12, Adieu. The sound of the drum changed again. The final tap disappeared and it became nothing but boom, 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 boom. Lester used only his tail, bringing it down with great force and seriousness upon the drum. The threadmaster retreated. The room full of mice fell silent, expectant, waiting. And as Despereaux stood before them with the red thread around his neck and the 14 members of the Mouse Council perched on the bricks above him, two burly mice came forward. Black pieces of cloth covered their heads. There were slits for their eyes. "We," said the bigger of the two mice, "will escort you to the dungeon." "Despereaux!" Antoinette called out. "Ah, my Despereaux!" Despereaux looked out into the crowd of mice and saw his mother. She was easy to spot. In honor of her youngest mouse being sent to the dungeon, she had put on a tremendous amount of makeup. The hooded mice each put a paw on one of Despereaux's shoulders. "It's time," said the one on the left, the first hood. Antoinette pushed her way through the crowd. "He is my son," she said. "I want to have a last word with my son." Despereaux looked at his mother. He concentrated on standing before her without trembling. He concentrated on not being a disappointment. "Please," said Antoinette, "what will happen to him? What will happen to my baby?" "Ma'am," said the first hood. His voice was deep and slow. "You don't want to know." "I want to know. I want to know. He is my child, the child of my heart, the last of my mice babies." The hooded mice said nothing. "Tell me," said Antoinette. "The rats," said the first. "The rats," said the second. "Yes, yes, the rats. What of them?" "The rats will eat him," said the second hood. "Ah," said Antoinette, "mon Dieu!" At the thought of being eaten by rats, Despereaux forgot about being brave. He forgot about not being a disappointment. He felt himself heading into another faint. But his mother, who had an excellent sense of dramatic timing, beat him to it. She executed a beautiful, flawless swoon, landing right at Despereaux's feet. "Now you've done it," said the first hood. "It doesn't matter," said the second. "Step over her. We have a job to do. Nobody's mother is going to stop us. To the dungeon." "To the dungeon," repeated the first hood, but his voice, so deep and certain a moment ago, now shook a tiny bit. He put a paw on Despereaux and tugged him forward, and the two hoods and Despereaux stepped over Antoinette. The crowd parted. The mice began again to chant, "To the dungeon, to the dungeon, to the dungeon." The drumbeat continued, boom, 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 and Despereaux was led away. At the last moment, Antoinette came out of her faint and shouted one word to her child. That word, reader, was adieu. Do you know the definition of adieu? Don't bother with your dictionary, I will tell you. Adieu is the French word for farewell. Farewell is not the word that you would like to hear from your mother as you are being led to the dungeon by two oversized mice in black hoods. Words that you would like to hear are, "Take me instead. I will go to the dungeon in my son's place." There is a great deal of comfort in these words. But, reader, there is no comfort in the word farewell, even if you say it in French. Farewell is a word that, in any language, is full of sorrow. It is a word that promises absolutely nothing. Chapter 13, Perfidy Unlimited. Together, the three mice traveled down, down, down. The thread around Despereaux's neck was tight. He felt as if it was choking him. He tugged at it with one paw. "Don't touch the thread," barked the second hood. "Yeah," echoed the first hood. "Don't touch the thread." They moved quickly, and whenever Despereaux slowed down, one of the two hoods poked him in the shoulder and told him to keep moving. They went through holes in the wall and down golden stairs. They went past rooms with doors that were closed and doors that were flung wide. The three mice traveled across marble floors and under heavy velvet drapes. They moved through warm patches of sunlight and dark pools of shade. This, thought Despereaux, was the world he was leaving behind, the world that he knew and loved. And somewhere in it, the Princess Pea was laughing and smiling and clapping her hands to music, unaware of Despereaux's fate. That he would not be able to let the princess know what had become of him seemed suddenly unbearable to the mouse. Would it be possible for me to have a last word with the princess? Despereaux asked. A word? Said the second hood. You want a word with a human? I want to tell her what has happened to me. Geez, said the first hood. He stopped and stamped a paw on the floor in frustration. Cripes, you can't learn, can you? The voice was terribly familiar to Despereaux. Furlough? He said. What? Said the first hood irritably. Despereaux shuddered. His own brother was delivering him to the dungeon. His heart stopped beating and shrunk to a small, cold, disbelieving pebble. But then, just as quickly, it leapt alive again, beating with hope. Furlough, Despereaux said, and he took one of his brother's paws in his own. Please let me go. Please, I am your brother. Furlough rolled his eyes. He took his paw out of Despereaux's. No, he said, no way. Please, said Despereaux. No, said Furlough. Rules are rules. Reader, do you recall the word perfidy? As our story progresses, perfidy becomes an even more appropriate word, doesn't it? Perfidy was certainly the word that was in Despereaux's mind as the mice finally approached the narrow, steep stairs that led to the black hole of the dungeon. They stood, the three mice, two with hoods and one without, and contemplated the abyss before them. You can see them there in the illustration. And then Furlough stood up on his hind legs and placed his right paw over his heart. For the good of the castle mice, he announced to the darkness, we deliver this day to the dungeon a mouse in need of punishment. He is, according to the laws we have established, wearing the red thread of death. The red thread of death? Repeated Despereaux in a small voice. Wearing the red thread of death was a terrible phrase, but the mouse didn't have long to consider its implications because he was suddenly pushed from behind by the hooded mice. The push was a strong one, and it sent Despereaux flying down the stairs into the dungeon. As he tumbled, whisker over tail, through the darkness, there were only two words on his mind. One was perfidy, and the other word that he clung to was pea. Perfidy, pea, perfidy, pea. These were the words that pinwheeled through Despereaux's mind as his body descended into the darkness. Chapter 14, Darkness. Despereaux lay on his back at the bottom of the steps and touched the bones in his body one by one. They were all there, and, amazingly, they were unbroken. He got to his feet and became aware of a terrible, foul, extremely insulting smell. The dungeon, reader, stank. It stank of despair and suffering and hopelessness, which is to say that the dungeon smelled of rats. And it was so dark. Despereaux had never before encountered darkness so awful, so all-encompassing. The darkness had a physical presence, as if it were a being all of its own. The mouse held one small paw up in front of his whiskers. He could not see it, and he had the truly alarming thought that perhaps he, Despereaux Tilling, did not even exist. "Oh, my!" he said out loud. His voice echoed in the smelly darkness. "Perfidy," said Despereaux, just to hear his voice again, just to assure himself that he did exist. "Pea," said Despereaux, and the name of his beloved was immediately swallowed up. by the darkness. He shivered, he shook, he sneezed. His teeth chattered. He longed for his handkerchief. He grabbed hold of his tail. It took him a long, frightening moment to even locate his tail. So absolute was the darkness. To have something, anything to hold on to. He considered fainting. He deemed it the only reasonable response to the situation in which he found himself. But then he remembered the words of the threadmaster: honor, courtesy, devotion, and bravery. I will be brave, thought Despereaux. I will try to be brave like a knight in shining armor. I will be brave for the Princess P. How best for him to be brave? He cleared his throat. He let go of his tail. He stood up straighter. Once upon a time, he said out loud to the darkness. He said these words because they were the best, the most powerful words that he knew, and just the saying of them comforted him. Once upon a time, he said again, feeling a tiny bit braver, there was a knight, and he wore always an armor of shining silver. Once upon a time, boomed a voice from the darkness. A knight in shining armor? What does a mouse know of such things? That voice, the loudest voice that Despereaux had ever heard, could only, he assumed, belong to the world's largest rat. Despereaux's small, overworked heart stopped beating, and for the second time that day, the mouse fainted. So that is the end of our chapters for today. It ends kind of on a cliffhanger. We will have to wait till tomorrow to find out how it turns out for Despereaux.